Former military policeman Morgan bought the abandoned Blackwood Point prison to escape his past, but the island had ghosts of its own. Exactly at midnight, a terrifying sound tore through the silence. A massive slam echoed through the corridors, as if hundreds of heavy steel cell doors had just slammed shut all at once. His German shepherd, Warden, lunged toward the cell block, barking furiously into the darkness. Morgan tried to dismiss it as a stress-induced hallucination or just an echo from the storm. But when he took his flashlight to investigate, he was confronted by an inexplicable physical reality. Every single door, doors he knew for a fact had been wedged open, were now slammed shut. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The ocean air off the coast of Maine was sharp, heavy with salt and the smell of damp stone. It was an isolating smell, one that signaled the end of the mainland and the beginning of something else. For Morgan, it was the smell of a final commitment. He stood on the ferry dock of Blackwood Point, watching the small workboat that had delivered the last of his supplies disappear into the thick afternoon fog. The island was his now. All 20 acres of granite, stunted pines, and the colossal, terrifying structure that dominated its center. Blackwood Point Federal Penitentiary. Closed since 1973, the prison stood against the gray sky like a ruined cathedral dedicated to misery. Its Gothic architecture, all sharp angles and imposing towers, seemed to absorb the light. Morgan pulled the collar of his old brown leather jacket tighter. The jacket was unzipped, revealing a plaid flannel shirt of navy, gray, and beige beneath it. He was a tall man, in his late 40s, with a lean, strong frame that spoke of a life of disciplined activity. His brown hair was cut short, practical, with deep silver wings spreading from his temples. His face was rugged, carved by hardship and too many sleepless nights, yet his eyes held a deep, quiet kindness. He was not a historian nor a developer looking to build luxury condos. He was a former military police officer, and he was a man haunted. He was haunted by the echo of shouting, the clang of metal on metal, and the sickening heat of a fire he could not control. He was haunted by a prison riot years ago, a failure of command that had cost a good man his life. He was haunted by chaos. And so he had bought chaos. He had poured every cent he had, his pension, his savings, into purchasing this monument to despair. His plan, insane to most, was an act of penance. He would turn this place of containment and suffering into a place of remembrance and history. He would take this symbol of his greatest failure, a prison out of control, and wrestle it back into order. He would build a museum. It was a symbolic attempt at atonement, a desperate need to prove to himself that order could be reclaimed from madness. A low whine pulled him from his thoughts. At his side, a large German shepherd stood watching him, its head cocked. This was Warden. The dog was magnificent, perhaps 8 years old, his coat not the typical black and tan, but a rare, striking sable of silver gray and brilliant white. He was calm, a steady, grounding presence, but his posture was always alert. His ears were radar dishes, constantly swiveling, cataloging the sounds of the island. The crash of waves, the cry of a distant gull, the rattling of a loose gutter high on the prison wall. Warden was Morgan's anchor. When the tides of memory threatened to pull Morgan under, the dog was the solid ground beneath his feet. "Well, boy," Morgan murmured, his voice rough from the cold air. "It's just us now. Let's get inside before that wind picks up." Warden pressed against his leg for a moment, a silent gesture of support, before trotting ahead toward the massive iron gates of the prison. They had set up a temporary living space in the old administrative wing, specifically in the former warden's office. It was the only room with intact windows and a fireplace that drew properly. It was still cold, the kind of damp cold that sinks into your bones, but it was defensible against the elements. Morgan spent the evening organizing their supplies, canned goods, tools, lanterns, and a small generator. Warden lay on a thick blanket near the hearth, seemingly asleep, but Morgan knew he was listening. The sounds of the old prison were a constant, unsettling symphony. The wind howled through the cell blocks like a mourning choir. Water dripped in unseen corridors. The entire building groaned under the pressure of the Atlantic wind, the settling of ancient stone. Morgan tried to ignore the weight of the place. He tried to focus on the blueprints, on the work ahead. But his mind kept drifting back to the main cell block visible from the office's reinforced window. It was a long, endless hallway of darkness, 3 tiers of open cells rising into an oppressive gloom. The sheer scale of it was suffocating. By 11 p.m., the wind had risen to a gale. It shrieked, no longer sounding like a choir, but a scream. Morgan gave up on the blueprints. He checked the simple cot he had set up in the corner, then sat on the edge, running a hand over Warden's broad head. The dog lifted his muzzle, licking Morgan's hand. "Just whine, boy," Morgan said, trying to reassure himself as much as the dog. "Just whine an old stone." He lay back on the cot, still wearing his boots and jeans, and stared at the ceiling. Sleep would not come. He listened to the storm, his muscles tight. He knew this feeling. It was the precursor to the memories, the tension before the snap. He closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythmic breathing of the dog beside him. His digital watch, a simple, durable model he had worn for years, beeped softly. Midnight. The sound that followed tore the night apart. It was not a creak. It was not a groan. It was a slam. A colossal, deafening impact of iron on iron, so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundations of the island. It was not one sound, but hundreds. A catastrophic, echoing boom, as if every cell door in the entire prison had been slammed shut at the exact same instant. Bam! The echo rolled through the corridors, a physical wave of sound that vibrated in Morgan's chest. Silence. The wind itself seemed to pause, stunned. Morgan froze, his heart stopping. In the second of absolute silence that followed, Warden exploded from a deep sleep into a fury. He was on his feet instantly, his gray and white fur bristling. A deep thoracic growl ripped from his chest, and he lunged toward the office door, facing the main cell block. He barked. It was not a bark of fear. It was a violent, defensive roar, an accusation hurled into the darkness. He barked at the unseen hallway, at the place where the impossible sound had been born. He knew where it came from. Morgan's breath hitched. His heart hammered against his ribs, not from the sound, but from what the sound represented. He stared past Warden into the pitch-black maw of the prison. The echo had faded, leaving only the sound of his own blood rushing in his ears and the furious, echoing barks of his only companion. The echo of the slam faded, swallowed by the stone, leaving a silence more terrifying than the noise itself. Morgan stood paralyzed in the center of the warden's office, his ears ringing. Warden, however, was a vibrating instrument of pure tension. His barks were short, percussive, and aimed directly at the heavy oak door that led to the prison proper. "Okay," Morgan breathed, his voice barely a whisper. His military training fought against the primitive urge to hide. Assess the threat, identify the source. He grabbed the high-lumen flashlight from his supply crate, the heavy metal tube feeling solid and inadequate in his hand. "Heel," Morgan commanded. His voice was tight. Warden stopped barking instantly, but the growl remained, a low-frequency rumble in his chest. The dog backed up, pressing his side against Morgan's leg, positioning himself between his owner and the door. "All right, easy boy, we look, that's all, we just look." Morgan opened the office door, the flashlight beam cutting a sharp white cone into the oppressive darkness of the main corridor. The air was noticeably colder here, and the smell of rust and salt was overwhelming. They advanced slowly, a 2-member team moving as one. Morgan held the light steady. Warden moved in perfect sync, his claws ticking softly on the concrete, his head low, scanning the shadows. Morgan knew this hallway. He had walked it 4 times since arriving, trying to assess the structural integrity. He knew, as a fact, that the doors to the ground floor cells were open. They were heavy slabs of iron, their locking mechanisms seized by decades of rust and neglect. He had specifically noted that many were wedged open by debris or the natural decay of the building. He swept the flashlight beam to the left. The first cell, closed. He moved the beam to the next one, closed. "No," he whispered. He swung the light down the long, cavernous hall. As far as the beam could penetrate the darkness, the sight was the same. A uniform line of solid black iron doors, all shut tight. It was not a hallucination. It was not a trick of the sound. This was cold, hard proof. A physical, impossible event had occurred. His mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. An earthquake? No, he would have felt a tremor that strong, and the office supplies would be scattered. A person? Impossible. No one else was on this island, and no single person could close 50 heavy, rusted doors at once. He had to touch one. He approached the nearest cell, number 37. Warden growled low, sniffing at the gap beneath the door. Morgan reached out a trembling hand. His fingers brushed the cold, pitted metal. It was real. He put his shoulder into it and pushed. For a second, the door held firm. Then, with a sound of tortured metal that set Morgan's teeth on edge, the door scraped open, grinding on its rusted hinges. The sound, that terrible grating sound of metal on metal. It snapped the last thread of his composure. He was no longer in Blackwood Point. He was back in the heat, the smoke, and the chaos of the Fort Leavenworth riot. The air was thick, tasting of ash and copper. The alarms were blaring, a deafening, repetitive shriek that blended with the roar of the inmates. He saw Frank, his colleague. Frank, who always had a bad joke, who was planning his daughter's birthday party for the following weekend. They were separated from their unit, trying to hold a containment line in C Block. "Morgan, the door! Close Sector 4!" Frank yelled over the din, shoving 2 inmates back. Morgan ran to the heavy sliding grill. He grabbed the handle and pulled, his muscles burning. It was supposed to slide smoothly, but it snagged. An overturned cot, wedged in the track. "It's stuck!" Morgan roared, yanking with all his weight. He saw the inmates surge. He saw their faces, masks of rage. He saw them break past Frank's defense line. "Frank!" He gave one last, desperate pull. The door was too heavy. The gap was too wide. He saw them pull Frank down. He remembered the sickening sound. He remembered failing to close the door. Now, standing in the dark hallway in Maine, Morgan couldn't breathe. His chest seized. The air was too thick, just like the smoke had been. He was gasping, but no air seemed to enter his lungs. The flashlight beam in his hand shook violently, scattering frantic circles of light across the walls. He was losing control. The very thing he had come here to escape, the chaos, the failure, it was here. It was all around him. No, not again. "Frank," he stammered, leaning his forehead against the cold bars of the cell he had just opened. The flashlight slipped from his sweating, nerveless fingers. It clattered onto the concrete floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The heavy beam died, and the hallway was plunged into a terrifying darkness, broken only by the weak, spinning glow of the flashlight's lens on the ground. The darkness was total, suffocating. Morgan slid down the bars, his back scraping the steel, until he was slumped on the floor, his head in his hands, lost in the memory of the fire. Warden had been growling at the dark hallway, a guardian facing an unknown enemy. But the moment the flashlight fell, the moment he heard Morgan's gasp, the dog's entire demeanor changed. The external threat was gone. The internal one, the one he knew, had taken over. He stopped growling. He turned from the hallway and rushed to Morgan's side in the dark. Morgan was rocking back and forth, hyperventilating. Can't breathe? Couldn't close it. Warden acted. This was a familiar drill. He shoved his heavy body against Morgan's side, a solid, insistent pressure. Morgan didn't react, lost in the riot. Warden became more forceful. He pushed his cold, wet muzzle hard into Morgan's clenched fist, forcing the man's fingers open. It was a sharp, sudden, real sensation. A pinprick of reality in the bubble of the panic. Morgan flinched, pulling his hand back. "What?" Warden whined. It was not a sound of fear, but a deep, urgent query. "I am here. Come back." He nudged Morgan's hand again, licking the sweat from his palm. The sensation, the cold nose, the rough tongue, cut through the memory. Morgan's vision began to clear. He wasn't smelling smoke. He was smelling the faint, dusty scent of his dog's fur. He wasn't hearing alarms. He was hearing Warden's soft, insistent whine. He let out a long, shuddering breath. His hand found the dog's thick ruff, gripping the fur like a lifeline. He buried his face in Warden's shoulder. "I'm here, boy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm here. I'm okay." He sat there on the freezing concrete floor of the cell block for several long minutes, just breathing. He focused on the simple, steady rhythm of the dog's respiration, matching it until his own heartbeat slowed. Warden didn't move, a solid, warm anchor in the absolute dark. Finally, Morgan's breathing was even. The panic had receded, leaving behind the familiar cold exhaustion. He reached out and fumbled for the flashlight, his fingers finding the metal casing. He picked it up and pressed the switch. The powerful beam shot out, steady once more. He looked at Warden, who was watching him with intense, intelligent eyes. "Good boy, good boy." Morgan used the bars to pull himself to his feet. He was drained, but he was calm. His MP training had resurfaced. He swept the light down the hallway one more time. The doors were still shut. The facts had not changed, but he had. The terror was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp resolve. This was not a ghost. This was not a memory. This was a puzzle. A physical event happened here, and he, Morgan, was going to find the cause. "Let's go, boy," he said, his voice firm. "Back to the office. We'll find out what this is in the morning." Morgan slept for less than an hour, slumped in the wooden chair, his hand resting on Warden's back. The dog had not left his side. When the first weak gray light of dawn filtered through the office's grimy windows, Morgan was already on his feet, his body stiff and aching from the cold and the adrenaline crash. He didn't speak. He grabbed the flashlight, a heavy-duty crowbar, and looked at Warden. "Watch." Warden sat by the office door, a silent gray and white sentinel, as Morgan returned to the main cell block. The daylight did not make the scene less terrifying. It only illuminated the impossibility of it. The long, three-tiered hall was just as he had found it in the dark. Every single heavy iron door on the ground floor was shut. He saw the splinters of wood and chunks of debris that he had seen wedged in the door jambs the day before, now crushed and spat out onto the concrete floor. Whatever had done this was not a person. It was a force. He returned to the office, his jaw set. His initial plan to catalog artifacts and map the decay seemed naive, childish. He was in a contest with the building itself. He needed to secure those doors, to stop this from happening, if only for his own sanity. But his current supplies were inadequate. He needed heavy chains, industrial-grade padlocks, and more tools. He needed to go back to the mainland. "Come on, boy," he said to Warden. "We're taking a trip." The ferry ride back to the small coastal town of Granite Harbor was short but jarring. Warden stood at the bow, his paws planted wide against the chop, his noble head held high as he tasted the wind. Morgan, however, leaned against the railing, his leather jacket zipped halfway against the sharp morning chill. He stared at the island shrinking behind them, its Gothic towers shrouded in mist. It wasn't a ghost. His logical mind, the mind of an MP, rejected it. Ghosts didn't close 50 doors with enough physical force to crush debris. This was physics, but a physics he could not understand. Granite Harbor was a working town, smelling of low tide, diesel, and frying fish. Its small main street was lined with brick buildings that had weathered a century of Atlantic storms. Their first stop was Hank's Hardware and Marine Supply. The bell above the door chimed, and a man at the back counter looked up from his ledger. He was in his late 60s with a face as weathered as the town's brickwork and shrewd, skeptical eyes under a flannel cap. A faded name patch on his vest read, "Hank." "Help you?" Hank asked, his voice a gravelly Maine accent. "I need supplies," Morgan said. "Heavy-duty chain, the thickest you have, about 200 feet, and 20 industrial padlocks, all keyed the same, and a sledgehammer." Hank raised a bushy white eyebrow. He began pulling the heavy items onto the counter, the chain links clattering loudly. Warden, who had sat politely by the door, watched the man with quiet, steady eyes. "That's a lot of security," Hank observed, ringing up the total. "Planning on keeping a boat tied up in a hurricane?" "Something like that," Morgan said, pulling out his wallet. I'm restoring the old prison on Blackwood Point." Hank stopped writing the receipt. He looked from Morgan to Warden, then back to Morgan. His skepticism softened into something like pity. "So you're the one. Heard someone bought the place," Hank said, lowering his voice. You stay the night out there?" "We did," Morgan said simply. "Then I reckon you're buying these chains 'cause you heard it." Morgan's blood ran cold. "Heard what?" "The Blackwood breath," Hank said, leaning on the counter. "Folks around here call it that. Old wives' tale, maybe. Maybe not. They say the island breathes. Happens on the bad storm nights, right around midnight. An old fisherman told me once, said he was anchored in the cove to wait out a storm. Said he heard the whole prison inhale, and then slam, like a giant shut his door." Morgan stared at the man, his face tightening. "A sound." "More than a sound, mister," Hank said, tapping the counter. "You're buying chains. You know it's more than a sound. No boatman I know will anchor there overnight. You're either a brave man or a fool to be out there at all, especially with a good dog." Warden, as if sensing the tension, stood up and moved to Morgan's side, pressing his body against his master's leg. "It's just wind, Hank. An old building," Morgan said, forcing a calm he didn't feel. "Wind don't close doors that heavy," Hank muttered, handing Morgan the receipt. "Good luck to you. You'll need it." Morgan left the store, the weight of the chains in his cart matched by the weight of Hank's words. It was known. He wasn't mad. He had one more stop. The Granite Harbor Historical Society was a small, neat white building near the town hall. Inside, the scent of old paper and floor polish hung in the air. A woman looked up from a desk cluttered with books and artifacts. "Can I help you?" This must be Mrs. Carol Holden. She was in her early 70s with a kind, intelligent face and sharp blue eyes magnified by her glasses. Her white hair was pulled back in a neat professional bun. "My name is Morgan," he said. "I'm the new owner of Blackwood Point. I was hoping to find any information you have on the prison, construction, history, anything." Mrs. Holden's eyes lit up with professional interest. "My goodness, that is a formidable project. I'm Carol Holden, the curator. Most people only ask about the ghost stories." "I'm more interested in the facts," Morgan said, his voice steady. "I was on the island last night, during the storm. I heard a very loud noise from the main cell block. Hank at the hardware store called it the Blackwood breath." Carol Holden's smile faded. "Ah, then you've experienced it. Please, sit. What you heard is, shall we say, the island's most tragic piece of folklore." She moved to a tall filing cabinet and pulled out a thick, dusty file labeled Blackwood Penitentiary. "Blackwood Point has a dark history, Mr. Morgan. Darker than most," she said, laying out a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline, dated October 23, 1954, read, "Tragedy at Blackwood. Fire claims dozens." Morgan stared at the grainy photograph of the prison, smoke billowing from a section he recognized. "A massive fire," Mrs. Holden explained, her voice soft. "It started just before midnight, during a storm very much like last night's. It ripped through C Block. Because of the storm, the boats from the mainland couldn't get there in time. 42 inmates died. They were trapped in their cells." Morgan felt a cold sickness creep into his stomach. Trapped. He thought of Frank. "How did it start?" he asked. "The official report," she said, tapping the file, "concluded it was faulty wiring, aggravated by the storm. A tragic accident." "You sound like you don't believe the official report," Morgan observed. Carol Holden pursed her lips. "I am a historian, Mr. Morgan. I deal in facts, and the facts are troubling. The investigation was concluded in less than 48 hours. The warden at the time, a man named Alistair Jameson, was very well connected politically. The fire was declared an accident, the bodies were removed, and the entire incident was filed away. Quietly." She pointed to another document, a public letter from 1956. 2 years later, several guards petitioned for a new investigation, claiming the prison was a death trap. that the materials used in its construction were shoddy. They were fired. The prison never recovered. It was plagued by incidents until it was finally decommissioned in 1973. Phew, Morgan's mind was racing, connecting the dots. Mrs. Holden, this sound, the breath. Did anyone report it before the fire? She paused, thinking. No, that's the curious part, isn't it? All the folklore, all the stories Hank tells. They all date from after the 1954 fire. The locals say it's the souls of the 42 men, slamming their doors, trying to get out. Morgan stood up, his mind clear. He looked at the clipping, at the name Alistair Jameson, at the words shoddy materials. Thank you, Mrs. Holden. You've been extremely helpful. Be careful, Mr. Morgan, she said, her kind eyes full of concern. Some histories are better left buried. On the ferry ride back, Morgan stood at the stern, watching the mainland disappear. The heavy chains and padlocks sat at his feet. Warden stood beside him, a solid, comforting presence. It wasn't ghosts. He was sure of it. The locals had linked the sound to the fire. It started after the fire. A fire hot enough to kill 42 men. A fire in a prison allegedly built with shoddy materials and covered up by a powerful warden. A new, terrible suspicion began to form in his mind. This wasn't a haunting. This was a crime scene. What if the fire hadn't just killed those men? What if the fire, combined with those cheap materials, had fundamentally and violently changed the structure of the building? What if the Blackwood breath wasn't the inhale of a ghost, but the sound of the wind moving through a structure that had been warped, broken, and compromised? He looked at the island, its dark towers rising from the sea. He wasn't just fighting a noise. He was investigating a mass casualty event that had been covered up for nearly 70 years. They returned to Blackwood Point under a sky the color of wet cement. The sea was agitated, slapping impatiently at the island's granite cliffs. Morgan unloaded the chains and padlocks onto the dock. The links clattered onto the stone with a heavy, final sound. He looked at the pile of metal, then up at the prison looming above him. Hank's words echoed in his mind. Wind don't close doors that heavy. He had bought the chains to impose his will on the building, to force the doors shut and silence the impossible. But the information from Carol Holden had changed his mission. He wasn't here to silence the prison. He was here to understand it. Chaining the doors now felt like a fool's errand. It was like putting a gag on a witness instead of listening to their testimony. The noise wasn't a haunting. It was evidence. "We're not using them, boy," Morgan said quietly to Warden, who was sniffing the rusted iron ring used to tie up boats. Warden looked up, his intelligent gray eyes seemingly understanding the shift in tone. They left the chains on the dock. For the next 2 days, an uneasy calm settled over the island. Morgan became the man he used to be, methodical, analytical, focused. The MP investigator took precedence over the haunted veteran. He spent hours in the warden's office, which he now treated as a field office. He tacked the old blueprints of the prison, salvaged from a damp desk drawer, onto the wall. He studied the 1954 fire. The blueprint confirmed C block was adjacent to the main A block, where he and Warden were staying. But more importantly, they shared a common spine, the primary ventilation system. He traced the thick lines on the aging paper. A massive central artery designed to move air through the entire complex, originating from the sea-facing cliffs, running beneath the main blocks, and venting out through stacks on the roof. The fire, according to Mrs. Holden's report, had been in C block. A fire hot enough to kill 42 men and require a cover-up must have generated unimaginable heat. What if that heat had warped, cracked, or even partially collapsed that central ventilation artery? "If you damage a chimney," he murmured, tapping the blueprint, "the fire doesn't just go out. It goes somewhere else." He spent the daylight hours walking the prison, but his focus had changed. He wasn't just looking at decay. He was looking for damage that correlated with the fire. He found sections of the outer wall in C block where the granite had been visibly scorched, the stone itself flaking away. He found hallways where the concrete floor was buckled, as if something immense had shifted the very foundations. Warden shadowed him, no longer the relaxed companion, but a partner on patrol. The dog seemed to sense the change in Morgan. The man's fear had been replaced by purpose, and this purpose energized the dog. Warden, too, was investigating, his nose constantly working, sampling the air, sniffing at cracks in the walls, his ears swiveling to catch the faintest echoes. On the third afternoon, the radio in the office crackled with the local weather report. A severe nor'easter was moving down the coast, projected to hit Blackwood Point with gale-force winds just after sundown. "Tonight's the night, boy," Morgan said. Warden, who had been dozing, lifted his head, whining softly. This time, Morgan prepared differently. He made coffee on his camp stove. He checked the batteries in his heavy flashlight and his digital camera. He put on his worn leather jacket, the familiar weight a comfort. He was not going to be a victim huddled in an office. He was going to be an observer at his post. By 10 p.m., the storm was raging. The wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It sounded like a living thing, enraged, clawing at the stone walls. Morgan and Warden left the relative safety of the office and moved to the entrance of the main cell block. The darkness inside was absolute. "We wait here," Morgan said, positioning himself against the thick stone archway. He could see the first few cells, their doors still standing open from when he had forced them back. Warden stood beside him, a statue of tense gray and white muscle. His fur bristled, but he made no sound. He just watched the darkness. The minutes ticked by. 11:30, 11:45. The sound began. It wasn't the sudden slam of before. It started as a low whistle, a faint high-pitched note from deep within the building. Warden's ears flattened, and he let out a low, almost silent growl. The whistle grew louder, descending in pitch until it became a deep, resonant moan. It sounded like the Blackwood breath Hank had described. Morgan felt it in his teeth, a vibration that ran from the concrete floor up through the soles of his boots. The prison was inhaling. Warden was visibly distressed. He paced in a tight circle, whining, his body trembling. He was agitated by the noise, clearly, but he wasn't barking. He wasn't staring at the cells. His gaze was fixed on the far end of the hallway. "What is it, boy?" Morgan whispered. "What do you hear?" His watch beeped. Midnight. The moan stopped. For one horrifying second, there was a pressurized silence. Then, slam! The force of the sound wave hit them like a physical blow. It was the same catastrophic, unified crash of iron on iron. Morgan flinched, his hand tightening on the flashlight, but he held his ground. He snapped the light on, illuminating the hall. The doors, 37, 38, 39, were all shut. Warden barked once, a sharp, frustrated sound, as if in protest of the noise itself. But then he did something new. He completely ignored the doors he was standing near. He trotted forward, his head low, moving purposefully down the center of the dark hallway. He moved past the closed cells, his claws ticking on the floor, his focus absolute. "Warden, heel!" Morgan commanded, confused. The dog ignored him. He was on a mission. "W!" Morgan sighed, then followed. "Okay, lead on. Show me." He kept the flashlight beam on the dog. Warden moved swiftly, past the first tier of cells, past the central staircase, until he reached the very end of the massive hall. The cell block terminated in a flat wall of solid granite. Set into this wall, high above their heads, were the grated openings for the upper tiers. But at floor level, there were two massive black iron grates, each one easily 6 feet tall and caked in decades of rust and grime. They were the main intakes for the ground-level ventilation system. Warden stopped directly in front of the grate on the left. He whined, a high, anxious sound. He pushed his nose against the rusted metal slats, sniffing so hard he snorted. The wind from the storm was dead, the noise over, but the dog was clearly smelling something. Then Morgan felt it. Even though the main slam was over, there was still a faint, steady draft being sucked into the vent. It was ice cold, and it smelled of deep, damp earth and ozone. Warden backed up, then lunged at the grate, scratching at the thick metal bars with his front paws. He looked back at Morgan, barked, a sharp, intelligent hear, and then returned to scratching, whining, and moaning in frustration. Morgan reached out and placed his hand on the grate. The metal was vibrating. He understood. The cells weren't the source. They were the symptom. The dog had ignored the effect and gone straight to the cause. The problem wasn't in the hallway, it was behind this wall. The 1954 fire had broken something deep inside the prison's lungs. The wind was being funneled, compressed, and turned into a weapon. "You found it, boy," Morgan whispered, a thrill of discovery cutting through his fear. "You found where it comes from." The morning after the storm, the prison was quiet, but it was a heavy, watchful silence. Morgan felt it too. He was an investigator now, and he had his primary suspect, the ventilation system. He knew what he had to do. The puzzle was no longer what was happening, but how. He needed data. He needed to see and measure the event, to strip it of its mythological power and reduce it to mere facts. This required another trip to the mainland. He and Warden took the ferry back to Granite Harbor. Hank, at the hardware store, saw him coming and gave him a knowing, somber nod. "Back already?" Hank asked. "I need cameras," Morgan said. "Simple ones, trail cameras maybe, and something to measure wind speed." Hank pointed him to a digital anemometer, a handheld device used by sailors. "This'll give you a reading. As for the cameras, you really want to take pictures of that breath?" "I want to understand it," Morgan said. He bought 3 motion-activated, low-light trail cameras and the anemometer. He felt a grim sense of purpose on the ride back to Blackwood Point. He was no longer a victim of the island's terrors. He was its analyst. He spent the next day, a day of unsettling calm, setting his traps. First, he went to the far end of the cell block, to the massive iron grate Warden had identified. He strapped the first camera to a pillar opposite the vent, its lens aimed directly at the source. Second, he placed the anemometer outside, securing it to the crumbling stone of the cliff-facing wall, near where the blueprints showed the main tunnel intake. He ran a small wire back to a digital logger he would keep in the office. Finally, he set up the other 2 cameras in the main cell block hallway. He put one at the far end, looking back toward the office, and one near the middle. He wanted to capture the event from multiple angles. He wedged all the ground floor doors open again, this time with a grim determination, noting the crushed debris from the last event. Then, he and Warden waited. The next day passed, and the wind was calm. The prison felt empty, hollow. Morgan worked on reinforcing the office windows, his mind entirely focused on the coming night. He and Warden ate in silence, the quiet anticipation a tangible thing. The weather report on the shortwave radio crackled to life that evening. A second, smaller storm system was approaching, a fast-moving gale expected to peak between 2 and 3 in the morning. Morgan didn't even try to sleep. He sat at the warden's desk, the digital logger for the anemometer in front of him, a cup of black coffee in his hand. Warden lay at his feet, not asleep, but in a state of low-level, watchful tension. The wind began to pick up around 1 a.m., a low whistle that grew steadily. At 2:37 a.m., the logger in front of Morgan began to register a rapid spike. 40 miles per hour, 50, 60. The wind from the northeast, the exact angle of the main intake, was hitting a critical speed. The sound began. That low, deep moan from the end of the hall. Warden's head snapped up, a low growl starting in his chest. "It's okay, boy," Morgan whispered, his eyes glued to the logger. The numbers climbed. 68, 69, 70. The moan inside the prison became a deafening, harmonic roar, as if a giant were blowing across the mouth of a massive stone bottle. Then, at 71 miles per hour, the roar stopped. The pressurized silence lasted 1, 2, 3 seconds. Slam! The concussion wave hit the office door, making the heavy oak rattle in its frame. Warden barked, a single, sharp sound of protest. The numbers on the anemometer began to drop. The gale had peaked. Morgan sat perfectly still for a full minute. The event was over. He got up, grabbed his flashlight, and looked at the dog. "Let's go see what we found." Warden was hesitant, but at Morgan's calm command, he followed, staying close to his master's leg. Morgan walked the length of the cell block. The doors were all shut. The air was still. He didn't feel the panic of before, only a cold, sharp-edged curiosity. He retrieved the SD card from the first camera, the one aimed at the grate. Then he collected the cards from the 2 cameras in the hallway. He returned to the office, Warden watching his every move. He slid the first card into his laptop. The footage was dark, grainy. It showed the iron grate. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then the audio picked up the moan. As the sound intensified, small particles of dust and debris on the floor in front of the grate began to vibrate, then dance. Suddenly, with a sound like a jet engine, a cloud of dust and grit was violently sucked into the vent. The audio peaked with a deafening roar, then cut to silence, followed by the distant, echoing bam of the doors. "The intake," Morgan whispered. He loaded the second card from the camera in the middle of the hallway. The low-light vision was surprisingly clear. It showed the long row of open cell doors. The audio picked up the moan. Morgan watched, transfixed. The open doors began to tremble, vibrating in their frames. Then, in perfect, terrible clarity, it happened. An invisible wave exploded down the hallway. The nearest door slammed shut with bone-jarring force, followed by the next, and the next, a catastrophic, sequential collapse. Bam, 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 bam. It was over in 2 seconds. Morgan let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He had it, cold, hard proof. He leaned back in his chair, piecing the evidence together. The 1954 fire, the shoddy materials Carol Holden mentioned. The intense heat must have caused a catastrophic failure deep inside the main ventilation tunnel, collapsing an interior wall or creating a massive rupture. Now, when the wind hit the cliff intake at precisely the right speed and angle, the tunnel became a giant, broken instrument. The air, instead of circulating, was funneled into that broken chamber. It compressed, building pressure, until it found the weakest point of escape. The ground floor vents in A block. The Blackwood breath wasn't a breath at all. It was an explosion. A focused directional pressure wave, a blast of compressed air, fired down the hallway with enough force to slam 50 iron doors. The mystery of the noise was solved. It was not a ghost. It was not a curse. It was a scar. A deep structural wound left by Alistair Jameson's greed and the fire that had killed 42 men. A profound, bone-deep sense of relief washed over Morgan. The oppressive, supernatural weight that had been crushing him lifted. He had faced the impossible, and he had understood it. He had taken chaos and wrestled it back into the realm of logic. He finally had control. He looked down. Warden had been watching him the entire time, sensing the shift in his master's energy. The dog's body was still tense, his ears alert. Morgan reached down and scrubbed the dog's thick ruff. Warden's tail gave a single, tentative thump. "It's just wind, boy," Morgan said, his voice rough with emotion. He smiled, a real weary smile. "Just wind, and a very, very broken building. It's okay. We're okay." At the sound of his master's calm voice, the long, coiled tension drained out of the German shepherd. Warden let out a deep, satisfied sigh, pushed his heavy head onto Morgan's knee, and finally, truly, relaxed. The week that followed was one of profound, blessed peace. With the supernatural terror vanquished, replaced by a complex but understandable engineering problem, the entire island felt different. The oppressive weight of dread had lifted. Blackwood Point was no longer a place of haunting. It was a place of work. Morgan had never felt more capable. He retrieved the heavy chains from the dock, but he used them for his new project. He ferried over bags of concrete, steel mesh, and lumber. His new mission was to seal the breach, to silence the Blackwood breath forever. He established a work zone at the far end of the cell block, near the massive ventilation grate that Warden had identified. It was heavy, dirty labor. He spent his days mixing concrete, studying the blueprints and planning how to access the damaged tunnel. He was an MP again, securing a compromised site. Every shovelful of gravel, every new piece of lumber set in place, felt like a small victory over the chaos that had haunted him for years. Warden was a different dog. With the agonizing high-frequency moan and the concussive slam gone from his world, his anxiety evaporated. The gray and white shepherd, who had been a vibrating coil of tension, was now at ease. He would spend hours dozing in the pale shafts of sunlight that cut through the high, barred windows of the cell block, his breathing deep and even. He would follow Morgan to the worksite, sniff the bags of concrete, and then settle down on a discarded tarp, a quiet supervisor. Morgan found himself talking to the dog constantly, explaining his plans. "See, boy, if I can just reinforce this intake wall, I can build a new bulkhead. It'll divert the main airflow up to the roof stacks the way it was supposed to." Warden would thump his tail, seemingly content just to listen to the sound of his master's voice, now steady and confident. The panic attacks had ceased. The nightmares of Frank and the fire had receded, replaced by the satisfying exhaustion of physical work. It was on the fourth day of this new routine that the change began. It was subtle. So subtle Morgan didn't notice it at first. He was in the cell block, measuring a cut in a 2x4. He finished the cut, brushed the sawdust from his jeans, and looked over at Warden's tarp. The dog was gone. "Warden," Morgan called out, his voice echoing in the vast empty hall. "Here, boy." He expected to hear the familiar tick-tick-tick of claws on concrete. Nothing. A prickle of unease, a cold echo of his past fear, touched him. He walked back toward the administrative wing, his heavy boots loud in the silence. "Warden!" He entered their living quarters, the large warden's office that had become their sanctuary. Warden was there. He was standing in the far corner of the room, near the fireplace. He was completely motionless, his head cocked, staring intently at the wall. "What are you doing, boy?" Morgan said, his voice thick with relief. "You had me worried." Warden didn't look at him. He didn't turn. He didn't flick an ear. He just stared at the wall. Morgan walked over, rubbing his tired hands on his pants. "What is it? You hear a mouse in there?" The office was a large, imposing room. Most of the walls were the same cold, exposed granite as the rest of the prison, with patches of crumbling plaster. But this corner, the section that ran from the fireplace to the outer wall, was different. It was covered, from floor to ceiling, in dark, rich oak paneling. It had always seemed out of place, a failed attempt to bring warmth to the cold, stark functionality of the prison. Warden was standing 2 inches from this wooden wall. He whined, a low, soft, questioning sound. "Leave it, boy," Morgan said, turning to go back to his work. "It's nothing." He took 2 steps, but Warden didn't follow. Morgan stopped. This was not like Warden. The dog was meticulously trained, bound to Morgan's commands. "Warden, come." The dog let out another soft, insistent whine. He lifted his right front paw and tapped it lightly against the middle of one of the oak panels. Snick, snick. His claws made a small, dry sound. "Hey," Morgan said more firmly, "what's gotten into you? Leave it." Warden ignored him. He pressed his nose to the seam where 2 panels met, sniffing deeply, his entire body quivering with a new, quiet intensity. This was not the alarm he had shown at the vent. This was not the defensive posture he'd taken during the midnight slam. This was fascination. Morgan sighed, his work forgotten. He walked over and knelt beside his dog, putting a hand on his back. "Okay, show me. What do you smell?" Warden licked his hand, a quick, distracted gesture, before pushing his nose back to the panel. He pawed at it again. Snick, snick. Morgan looked, truly looked at the wall for the first time. He ran his hand over the wood. It was smooth, but the varnish was different from the varnish on the heavy office door. It was slightly glossier, the application less even. He traced the edge of the paneling where it met the cold, rough granite. The rest of the office's woodwork was heavy, Victorian, built to last. This This was different. The joinery was less precise. It looked newer. He stood up and looked at the whole section. It covered about 8 feet of wall. It looked, he now realized, like a patch, a large, expensive, and oddly conspicuous patch. "It's just a wall, boy," Morgan said, unconvinced. Warden looked up at him, his gray eyes piercing. He whined again, a sound of profound canine frustration. "You are not listening." He then turned back to the wall, sat down, and simply stared at the panel, refusing to move. Morgan was a man who trusted evidence. The cameras and the anemometer had proven his logic sound. But he was also a man who trusted his partner. And it was Warden's evidence, his insistence on the vent, that had pointed him in the right direction. Now that same partner was signaling again. Morgan crossed his arms, his gaze fixed on the oak paneling. The vent had been a problem of physics. It was loud, violent, and demanded attention. This was silent. It was a secret. Warden had been deafened by the roar of the wind, just as Morgan had been. They had been so focused on the screaming, they had missed the whisper. "It's not a mouse, is it?" Morgan murmured. He knocked on the panel Warden had indicated. It sounded solid. He knocked on the next one. Solid. He moved down the wall, tapping. Then, on the panel lowest to the floor, the one half hidden by the shadow of the empty fireplace, his knuckles produced a different sound. It was not a thud. It was a thump, a hollow, empty, resonant sound. Warden sprang to his feet, his tail giving one sharp, excited wag. He pawed at that specific panel. Snick, snick, snick. A new trail. Morgan felt a cold, familiar thrill, the sensation he used to get just before a raid. The sense of an uncovered truth. He looked from the hollow-sounding panel to his dog. Warden sat back, panting softly, as if to say, "Well, what are you waiting for?" The ventilation project, the concrete, the noise, it all faded from his mind. A new puzzle was in front of him, one hidden in plain sight, in the very room where he slept. The sound was unmistakable. Thump. Morgan stayed kneeling on the cold floor, his hand resting on the panel Warden had indicated. He knocked again, harder this time. Thump. It was a sound of empty space, a stark contrast to the dense, solid thud of the surrounding panels he had tested just moments before. Warden, sensing the change in his master's focus, let out a low, excited whuff of air. He pushed his nose against the panel, sniffing at the tiny seams, his entire body vibrating. "You're right, boy," Morgan murmured, his voice low. The investigator in him, the part that had been lying dormant since the riot, was now wide awake and in full command. The puzzle of the wind had been a matter of physics. This was a matter of intent. He stood up and took a step back, examining the entire corner of the room. The oak paneling ran from floor to ceiling, from the edge of the massive stone fireplace to the corner of the outer wall. It was the only part of the office finished this way. The other 3 walls were just the original cold granite, covered in peeling plaster and paint. His MP training kicked in, demanding observation before action. Why panel this corner? It wasn't for beauty. The room was a fortress of function. This paneling was an anomaly. He looked closer, running his fingers over the seams. The craftsmanship was excellent, cleverly installed. The wood was fitted tightly, the joins almost invisible. But as he had noted before, the varnish was wrong. It was too glossy. It was a patch job, but a very, very good one. It wasn't meant to decorate the room. It was meant to match the room, to blend in, to hide the fact that this section of the wall had been modified. He looked down at the baseboard. Where the paneling met the floor, the trim was slightly different from the trim around the fireplace hearth. The cut was newer. The nails were modern. This wasn't original to the 1973 closure. It was newer than that. Or was it? Maybe it was an older secret, one that had simply been maintained well. "Someone didn't want anyone looking back here," he said to Warden. He knelt again and pressed his ear to the hollow-sounding panel, tapping it with his knuckle. The echo was distinct, a small, boxy sound. This was not a structural void. This was a space, a deliberately constructed niche. "Okay," he said, standing up and brushing the dust from his jeans. "Let's see what they were so keen to hide." He went to the heavy metal supply crate near his cot. He opened it, the hinges groaning, and rummaged past flares, first aid kits, and packaged meals. At the bottom were his heavy tools. He didn't grab the sledgehammer. This wasn't a demolition job. This was an exhumation. He selected a 20-inch flat pry bar and a claw hammer. Warden watched, his intelligent gray eyes tracking his every move, his plumed tail giving a single, excited thump-thump-thump against the floor. Morgan returned to the wall. He laid his tools down carefully. "Stand back, boy." Warden took 3 steps back, sitting on his haunches, his focus absolute. Morgan examined the panel. There were no visible screws, no obvious way in. It had been designed to resist casual inspection. He chose the seam closest to the floor, where the hollow sound was most pronounced. He carefully worked the thin, flat edge of the pry bar into the hairline crack between the panels. He applied gentle pressure. The wood groaned, but it held. The fit was tight. He tapped the end of the pry bar with the heel of his hand. It sank another 1/4 inch. He pulled back. The panel bowed slightly, but the nails, hidden deep in the tongue and groove joint, held fast. "They really didn't want this opened," he muttered. He repositioned the bar, this time using the hammer to tap it deeper into the seam, seeking leverage. He found a purchase point. He put his weight into the bar. There was a sharp cracking sound of splitting wood, and the panel's bottom edge popped out an inch, revealing a dark, dusty gap. Warden sprang forward, whining, shoving his nose into the new opening. He sniffed once, twice, then sneezed at the sudden cloud of ancient dust. But he didn't back away. He kept sniffing, his entire body now rigid. He was smelling something, not decay, not mold, but something else. Something dry. Old paper. Faint traces of metal. "Easy, boy," Morgan said, pushing the dog back gently. He now had the leverage he needed. He worked the pry bar up the side of the panel. One by one, he located the hidden nails and forced them, groaning from their long concealment. The sounds were loud in the quiet office, the screech of old metal, the crack of dry wood, the pop of the final joint giving way. With a last heavy pull, the entire 4-foot section of paneling came loose. Morgan gripped the heavy oak and pulled it away from the wall. He half expected to see the rough gray granite of the prison's main structure. He did not. Behind the panel was a small, square void, about 2 feet tall and 2 feet wide. It was not a natural gap. It had been constructed. The inside of the void was neatly lined with newer, smoother bricks and sealed with mortar, creating a small, dry recess. It was a safe, custom-built, and perfectly hidden. Warden pressed forward, his nose working furiously, sniffing at the dark, dry air that poured from the opening. Morgan grabbed his flashlight from the desk. His heart was pounding, not with fear this time, but with the cold thrill of discovery. The blackwood breath was the island's wound. This was its secret. He aimed the beam of the flashlight into the dark, square opening. The light cut through the dust motes, illuminating the brick-lined interior. And there, sitting in the center of the dry recess, was a dark, square shape. The beam of the flashlight cut through the small, dark space, illuminating the object of Warden's fixation. It was not a safe. It was not a weapon. It was a simple, dark green metal box, about the size of a large shoebox. It looked like an old document case or a cash box, its paint flaking, its corners showing dull gray metal beneath. Morgan reached into the dry, brick-lined recess. His fingers, rough from mixing concrete, brushed against the cold, dusty lid. He grasped the box. It was heavy, heavier than he expected. He slid it out carefully, maneuvering it through the opening he had made. Warden immediately pushed forward, his entire body quivering. He shoved his gray and white muzzle against the box, sniffing it intensely from every angle. He snorted at the dust, sneezed, but immediately returned, his nose working overtime. This was it. This was the scent that had cut through the smells of old stone, dust, and their own presence. This was the trail he had been trying to show his master. "Easy, boy," Morgan said, his voice low and tight. He placed the box on the wooden floor in the pool of light from the flashlight. He looked at it. A simple clasp on the front, rusted but intact. No keyhole, no combination lock. He looked at the wall he had just opened. The careful carpentry, the brick-lined dry void. The simplicity of the container struck him as a profound contradiction. Why go to the trouble of building a secret blended wall, a perfect hiding place, only to put an unlocked box inside? His MP mind, trained in patterns and human behavior, supplied the answer. Haste? This wasn't a long-term vault for treasure. This was a panicked stash. This was someone hiding something right now, with every intention of coming back for it. Someone who didn't have time to find a key or work a combination. Someone who was interrupted. Someone who perhaps never got the chance to return. His thoughts immediately went to Carol Holden's words. The 1954 fire, the cover-up, the petition from the guards. He looked at Warden, who had sat back on his haunches, his duty as the finder complete. Now he was the guardian, watching Morgan, his ears pricked, his gray eyes reflecting the beam of the flashlight. "You found the why, didn't you, boy?" Morgan whispered. With a deep breath, he put his thumbs under the rusted clasp and pushed up. The metal groaned in protest, stiff from disuse, then suddenly snapped open with a dry metallic click. Morgan paused, his hands on the lid. He felt a sudden irrational reluctance. The blackwood breath had been a physical puzzle. It was loud, it was violent, but it was impersonal. This felt different. This was a secret kept by a human. To open this lid felt like violating a tomb. Warden, sensing his hesitation, let out a soft whine and nudged his hand with his cold nose. "Go on." Morgan lifted the lid. A puff of dry, ancient air escaped, carrying the scent of decades-old paper, dry ink, and the faint tannic smell of cured leather. The box was full. On top lay a large, heavy book. It was not leather-bound, but covered in thick, dark blue canvas, the kind used for official ledgers. Morgan lifted it out. It was heavy, its pages thick cardstock. There was a simple, typewritten label on the cover, the ink faded but perfectly legible. Blackwood Point Penitentiary. Disbursements and Materials, 1950, 1954. Morgan's blood ran cold. He ran his thumb over the dates. The log ended the year of the fire. This was a detailed accounting ledger. His mind flashed to the words from the 1956 petition. Shoddy materials. He set the ledger carefully on the floor beside him. Beneath where it had lain was the second item. It was smaller, more personal. It was a personal leather-bound diary. The leather was dark brown, almost black, and cracked with age. It was soft to the touch, the corners worn smooth. Unlike the ledger, there was no label, no title. Just a simple, elegant set of initials embossed in faded gold on the cover. A.J. Alistair Jameson, the first warden, the man who had overseen the prison's construction, the man who had quashed the investigation into the fire. Morgan felt a weight settle on him that was heavier than the blackwood breath had ever been. He had found it. He had found the motive. The two mysteries were one. The breath was the result of the crime. This box held the reason. The shoddy materials bought with stolen funds, detailed in the ledger, had caused the building to fail. They had allowed the fire to rage out of control, killing 42 men. And they had warped the ventilation system, turning it into the screaming, door-slamming monster that had haunted the island for 70 years. This box was the prison's soul, its dark, guilty secret. He looked at Warden. The dog was calm, his tail giving a low, slow thump on the floor. He had no interest in the books. His master was calm. The tension was gone from the room. The hunt was over. Morgan reached out and buried his hand in the dog's thick gray and white ruff. He gripped the fur, grounding himself. "You found it, Warden," he said, his voice thick with a strange, somber awe. The noise was just an echo. You found the voice. He carefully lifted the 2 books. He stood up, his knees cracking, and walked over to the heavy warden's desk. He placed the ledger and the diary side by side under the cone of the electric lantern. They looked alien in the dim light, relics from a tragedy, brought to light by a man and his dog, both looking for their own kinds of peace. He picked up the panel he had ripped from the wall. He looked at the hollow, empty space. He thought about Alistair Jameson in this very room, perhaps hearing the first shouts of the fire, hurriedly stashing his guilt behind a false wall before he— What? Fled? Tried to manage the disaster he had created? It was a story waiting to be read. He turned his attention back to the desk, his hand resting on the cover of the leather diary. The investigation was just beginning. The warden's office was tomb silent. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic breathing of Warden lying by the desk and the faint, distant moan of the wind, a natural, harmless sound now, stripped of its menace. Morgan sat at the desk, the 2 books illuminated by the cold, steady beam of his electric lantern. The metal box sat empty beside them. For a long moment, he just looked at them, at the physical proof Warden had unearthed. The ledger represented the crime. The diary held the confession. He was an investigator. He would start with the facts. He pulled the heavy canvas-bound ledger toward him. Disbursements and Materials, 1950, 1954. He opened it. The pages were thick, the lines precise, the entries written in a neat, controlled cursive. Columns for item, supplier, PO number, cost official, and cost actual. Morgan's brow furrowed. Cost official and cost actual? He stood and walked to his own supply crate, pulling out a thin file folder. Before committing his life savings, he had done his due diligence, pulling the prison's original public-facing construction manifests from the state archives. He brought the file back to the desk and opened it. He found the first major entry. Structural steel, C-block. The public record, which he held in his left hand, showed a massive order from Bethlehem Steel, Grade A. He looked at Alistair Jameson's private ledger in his right hand. The same date, the same PO number, but the entry was different. Supplier, Eastern Metals Lomdi Teed. Item, structural steel, secondary grade. Then he saw the numbers. The cost official column matched the public record perfectly, but the cost actual column was nearly 40% lower, and beside it, a final column, surplus. The difference, a sum that would be significant today and was a fortune in 1951, was logged and initialed AJ. Morgan felt a cold sickness. He turned the page. Fire-resistant mortar mix. The public record specified a high-grade, expensive compound. Jameson's private ledger showed standard river sand mix. The surplus column grew. Page after page, the story was the same. He was replacing fireproof building materials with cheap materials. Alistair Jameson had not just built a prison, he had built a facade. He had systematically hollowed out its integrity, replacing strength with weakness, safety with hazard, and pocketing the difference. This, Morgan realized, was the Blackwood breath. The ruptured ventilation, the warped structure. It wasn't just an accident. It was the inevitable result of this embezzlement. He closed the ledger, his hands feeling unclean. He looked at Warden. The dog was watching him, sensing the change in his master. Morgan's relief from solving the first mystery was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged anger. He picked up the second book, the personal, leather-bound diary. The initials AJ seemed to mock him. He opened it. The handwriting here was different, less rigid, more fluid, the arrogant script of an important man. The first several years, 1950 to 1953, were filled with mundane entries, meetings in Boston, the delivery of a new suit, complaints about the weather. But sprinkled among them were notes of his success. The Boston account is healthy, and the house in Kennebunkport will be a fine summer retreat. The fruits of his crime. Morgan skipped ahead, his eyes scanning for the fall of 1954. The tone changed. September 14th, 1954. That fool Reynolds in engineering is asking questions. He claims the mortar mix in C block is substandard. I have reminded him who signs his paychecks. October 5th, 1954. The State Board is sending an auditor, a simple records check. They won't find anything in the official books. But the paper trail? The invoices from Eastern Metals? They must be disposed of. Morgan's heart began to pound, a slow, heavy drum. He turned the page. Yes, October 21st, 1954. The storm is the perfect cover. It is set for tomorrow night. A small fire in the C Block Records office. Regrettable, but necessary. A simple electrical fault aggravated by the wind. It will burn the paper, and I will be free. I will transfer the last of the surplus funds in the morning. Morgan read the words again, his blood turning to ice. Alistair had planned it. This wasn't just a cover-up. It was premeditated arson. He felt Warden push his head against his knee, a solid, grounding presence. Morgan unconsciously placed a hand on the dog's ruff, gripping the fur as he turned the page. The next entry was dated October 23rd, 1954. 1:00 a.m. The handwriting was almost illegible, a frantic scrawled script that tore across the page. It's too fast. The fire, it's not staying in the records room. It's in the walls, the cheap materials. The mortar, it's crumbling. The fire is spreading through the stone. The C block alarms are ringing. The power is gone. The wind from the storm. The ventilation. It's fanning the flames. God, the smoke is everywhere. 2:00 a.m. I can hear them. The men, they are trapped. The steel doors, they've warped from the heat. The locks are melted. They can't get out. 3:00 a.m. The fire spread out of control. 40 men, maybe more. The sound. I have the private ledger and the diary. I have hidden them. I must get to the boat. This place is lost. They are lost. Morgan stared at the last line until the words blurred. He had caused the massacre. 42 men, Carol Holden had said. 42 men, cooked alive in their cells, not by an accident, not by faulty wiring, but by one man's greed and his bungled, monstrous attempt to hide it. He slowly closed the diary. A memory, sharp and unwanted, lanced through him, the smell of smoke, the sound of shouting, Frank, his face a mask of terror, disappearing under a wave of rioting inmates. The door he couldn't close. The failure. He was haunted by failure. His failure. A bitter parallel settled over him, so heavy he could barely breathe. He had spent years drowning in guilt over a tragedy he was powerless to stop. This place, Blackwood Point, was his penance, his attempt to find peace with his own helplessness. But Alistair Jamieson, he was not helpless. He was not a victim of circumstance. He was the architect. He had control of every brick, every dollar, every decision. He had chosen this. He had intentionally started the fire that killed those men. Morgan's grief, which had been a cold, heavy stone of shame, suddenly ignited. It transformed into a white-hot, righteous rage. This wasn't a place of failure. This was a place of profound, hidden injustice. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly. Warden jumped to his feet, whining at the sudden, sharp movement. "It's not over, boy," Morgan said, his voice a low growl he didn't recognize. "It's not over." This man, Alistair Jamieson, had caused this. He had hidden his guilt behind a false wall and fled, leaving 42 souls to burn and a building to scream his crime into the wind for 70 years. Morgan looked at the laptop on his supply crate. He had a satellite internet adapter, his only link to the outside world. He fired it up, the small device whirring to life. He had a name, Alistair Jamieson. He typed it into the search engine. He found old newspaper articles, a brief report on the 1954 fire. He found a glowing obituary from 1968, praising Jamieson as a civic builder and philanthropist. The obituary mentioned his survivors, his beloved wife, Mary, and his son, Alistair Jamieson, Jr. Morgan's fingers flew across the keyboard. He searched for the son. This led him to a prominent New England political dynasty. And then he found him, the living descendant, a polished, smiling face beamed back at him from a campaign website. The headline read, "Senator Jameson, a legacy of integrity for Maine." Senator Jameson, the grandson. Morgan stared at the picture of the smiling politician, then back at the confessional diary and the ledger of theft on his desk. The legacy wasn't integrity. The legacy was murder, and it was still being hidden. His mission was no longer about restoring a building. It was about exposing a truth. Morgan spent the night reading the ledger and the diary again. He made meticulous, high-resolution photographs of every single page. By dawn, his rage had cooled, hardening into a cold, clear purpose. He felt a stillness he had not felt since before the riot. He knew exactly what he had to do. He used his satellite phone. A crisp, professional voice answered on the third ring. "Senator Jameson's office." "My name is Morgan," he said, his voice flat. "I am the new owner of Blackwood Point. Please tell the senator I have found his grandfather's private diary, the one from 1954. He gave the man his coordinates and the phone number. He did not need to wait long. 20 minutes later, the phone rang. A different voice, this one smooth, controlled, and dripping with authority, spoke. "Mr. Morgan, this is Senator Jameson. I understand you found an old family curio. I'd be very interested in seeing it. I'll be there in 3 hours." The line clicked dead. 3 hours later, a boat sliced through the calm morning water. It was not a fishing boat or a ferry. It was a long, sleek, black-hulled motor yacht, absurdly expensive, thrumming with quiet, powerful engines. It docked as if it owned the island. A man in a sharp, dark gray suit stepped onto the dock. This was Senator Jameson. He was in his late 50s, with a full head of perfectly coiffed silver hair and a face that was handsome, practiced, and cold. He looked at the crumbling prison with open, aristocratic distaste. He was, as Morgan had expected, the very image of power and condescension. Morgan stood at the main entrance, his worn leather jacket and plaid shirt a stark contrast to the senator's tailoring. Warden was at his side, not on a leash. The dog stood perfectly still, his gray and white fur bristling almost imperceptibly. He made no sound, but his eyes never left the new arrival. "Mr. Morgan," Jameson said, extending a hand he clearly did not expect Morgan to shake. "Thank you for seeing me. This place is atmospheric." He brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve. "This way," Morgan said, turning. He led the senator to the warden's office. The room was cold, lit only by the gray daylight and Morgan's electric lantern. The ledger and the diary were placed side by side in the center of the heavy oak desk. Jameson's practiced smile remained, but his eyes hardened as he saw the two books. He walked to the desk, his movements fluid and confident. He did not ask permission. He picked up the leather diary, his manicured fingers tracing the AJ initials. He opened it to a page Morgan had bookmarked, the frantic scrawled entry from the night of the fire. Jameson read it. His shoulders tightened. He read it again. The smile evaporated, replaced by a mask of cold fury. He snapped the diary shut. "A fascinating piece of fiction," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "My grandfather was a philanthropist, a builder. This is a forgery, a rather pathetic attempt at extortion." "I also found the ledger," Morgan said, tapping the canvas book, "the one that details the secondary grade steel and the river sand mix that built this place, the one that matches the funds going into his Boston account." Jameson stared at Morgan, a long, assessing silence. The mask of the politician fell away, revealing the predator beneath. "I ran a check on you, Mr. Morgan, on the ride over. I know who you are." He took a step closer, his voice a low, threatening purr. "A former MP, a promising career, until Fort Leavenworth, until the riot?" Morgan's breath caught. Warden sensed it, and a low growl like distant thunder rumbled in his chest. Jameson's eyes flicked to the dog, then back to Morgan. He smiled, a cold, sharp-edged expression. "That's right. The report was very specific. You froze. You couldn't secure a door, and your partner, a man named Frank, was killed. Tragic." He leaned in, his voice full of feigned sympathy. A man haunted by failure, living on a desolate island, suffering from, what did they call it? Severe PTSD. A man who suddenly finds a diary that could ruin a state senator. Jameson's first reaction was complete. He laid his threat on the table. Who do you think anyone would believe? A decorated public servant? Or a broken, unstable veteran? The old panic surged in Morgan. The smell of smoke, the alarms, the screaming. He felt the old, cold failure rise up, threatening to choke him. Then he felt a wet nose press firmly into his hand. Warden had moved, pressing his solid body against Morgan's leg, looking up at him. I am here. Come back. The grounding action worked. The panic receded. Morgan looked down at his dog, then back at the senator. The fear was gone, replaced by the cold, hard calm of his final purpose. You're right, Senator, Morgan said, his voice perfectly level. I did fail. I couldn't save Frank. That's a failure I will live with for the rest of my life. He paused, holding the senator's gaze. And it's because I know what that failure feels like that I learned to be prepared. I learned to never, ever be caught off guard again. Jameson's smile faltered. I knew you would do this, Morgan continued, his voice as cold as the stone walls. I knew you would threaten me, discredit me, so I created an ace in the hole, a dead man's switch. He pointed to the satellite phone on his cot. Before I ever called your office, I sent a package. It contains high-resolution copies of every page of that ledger and every page of that diary. Jameson's face paled. That package, Morgan said, was delivered 2 days ago to a man named Abraham Ford. He's an investigative journalist in Boston. Very sharp, very reputable. He's holding it for me. He has instructions, Morgan said, his voice relentless. If I do not check in with him via a coded email every 72 hours, he is to publish the entire story. The ledger, the diary, the 42 men who burned to death because your grandfather wanted a house in Kennebunkport. He took a step toward the senator. And just in case you decided to be practical and make me disappear, his instructions are also to publish if anything at all, happens to me, or to my dog. Warden sat, a silent gray statue, his presence a core part of the threat. The senator's threat vanished, the color drained from his face, replaced by a gray, waxy pallor. The politician was gone. The practical calculation of a cornered animal took its place. He stared at Morgan, his mind racing, seeing his career, his family's name, his entire life, hanging by the thread of a 3-day email check-in. He was forced to cooperate. What do you want? Jameson's voice was a harsh whisper. I don't want your money, Morgan said, straightening up. I want justice. This place isn't a museum. It's a tomb. It needs to be a memorial. You're going to pay to fix what he broke. Morgan tossed a file onto the desk. It was his proposal. You will fund the entire restoration. You will pay to repair the ventilation system. You will turn C Block into a permanent memorial for the 42 men who died there. This place will become the Blackwood Point Memorial Center. Jameson looked at the proposal, his mind already spinning the PR. A charitable donation to restore a state landmark, to honor the victims of a tragic decades-old structural failure. You can call it whatever you want in public, Morgan said, but you and I will know the truth, and you will pay for it. Jameson nodded, his jaw tight. Send the invoices to my private foundation, and Mr. Morgan, you will maintain your check-ins with your friend. Every 72 hours, Morgan confirmed. Now get off my island. The story concluded weeks later. The air was turning colder, the first true bite of late autumn in the wind. Morgan stood on the cliff path near the warden's office, Warden sitting calmly at his side. But the sound they heard was not the wind. It was the diesel rumble of a heavy barge and the shouts of men. Below them, a crew of workers was unloading scaffolding and heavy equipment onto the dock. The work had begun. Morgan looked at the main prison building. The Blackwood breath would be silenced soon. The injustice would be named. He thought of the 42 men, their names soon to be carved in granite. He reached down and rested his hand on Warden's head. He thought of Frank. The grief was still there, a familiar scar, but the sharp, agonizing edges of guilt had worn smooth. He couldn't change his past. He couldn't undo his own failure. But by bringing justice to the prison's past, he had, at long last, found a measure of peace for his own. A loyal heart, like Warden's, often sees the quiet truths our own past blinds us to. They don't just protect us from the storm, they help us find our peace within it. If stories of this profound bond between a veteran and his companion resonate with you, we hope you'll join our community by subscribing. Your comments and shares help these tales of loyalty find others who may need them, and the journey continues. Our newest tale has just appeared on the screen, and we invite you to watch it with us.